Stop believing everything you learned in history class. Because some of the biggest stories we grew up with, complete lies. And once you hear the truth, you'll never look at history the same way again. Look, I'm not here to tell you that your teachers were bad people. But the history we all learned, it's been twisted, simplified, and sometimes just flat out made up. And the crazy part is that these myths didn't just fool a few people. They changed how entire generations saw the world. They shaped wars, influenced politics, and created stereotypes that still exist today. So in this video, we're breaking down the biggest history myths that tricked everyone. And trust me, some of these are going to blow your mind. Here's the thing about history. It's not just facts and dates. It's stories and stories. They get changed every single time someone retells them. Sometimes it's an accident. Sometimes it's on purpose. But either way, what we end up with is a version of history that sounds good, fits a narrative, or makes someone look better than they actually were. The problem is that once these myths take hold, they spread everywhere. They end up in textbooks, movies, documentaries, and before you know it, millions of people believe something that never actually happened. So let's dig into these myths and figure out where they came from and why they stuck around for so long. Let's start with one of the most famous myths in American history. You know the story. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. We even have a rhyme for it. Except, here's the problem. He didn't discover anything. First of all, millions of people were already living in the Americas. They had entire civilizations, cities, trade routes, cultures that had been around for thousands of years. So the idea that Columbus discovered America is like me walking into your house and saying, I discovered your living room. But even if we ignore that massive problem, Columbus still wasn't the first European to reach the Americas. The Vikings beat him by about 500 years. Leif Erikson and his crew landed in what's now Newfoundland around the year 1000. There's actual archaeological evidence of Viking settlements there. We have the ruins. We have the artifacts. So why do we give Columbus all the credit? Because his voyage led to permanent European contact with the Americas. It kicked off colonization, trade, and unfortunately, a lot of suffering for indigenous people. But the myth that he discovered America, that was pushed hard in the 1800s, especially by Italian Americans who wanted a hero to celebrate. And it worked so well that we still have a holiday for the guy. Now let's talk about Napoleon. You've probably heard that he was super short, that he had a complex about his height. That's why he was always trying to conquer everything. Right? Wrong. Napoleon was actually average height for his time. He was about 5'6" or 5'7". So where did this myth come from? British propaganda. Britain was at war with France for years, and they wanted to make Napoleon look weak and ridiculous. So they started spreading cartoons and jokes about him being tiny. There was also some confusion with French measurements versus British measurements. In French units, Napoleon was listed as 5'2", but that was French feet, which were longer than British feet. When you convert it properly, he comes out to average height. But the British press ran with the short version because it was funnier and more insulting. And it stuck. 200 years later, people still think Napoleon was this tiny, angry guy. That's how powerful propaganda can be. Here's another one that's going to mess with you. You know how we're taught that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat, and that Christopher Columbus was brave because he sailed west, even though everyone thought he'd fall off the edge of the world? Yeah, that never happened. People in the Middle Ages knew the earth was round. Greek mathematicians had figured it out more than 1,000 years earlier. Educated people in Europe never forgot that. The church knew it. Sailors knew it. Scholars knew it. So why does everyone think medieval people were that clueless? Blame a guy named Washington Irving. He wrote a biography of Columbus in 1828, and he made up a bunch of stuff to make the story more dramatic. He invented this whole scene where Columbus argues with scholars who think the earth is flat. It never happened. Irving just thought it would make a better story. And because his book was super popular, that fake story became what everyone believed. Let's move to ancient Rome. You've probably seen movies where the crowd gives a thumbs down and the gladiator dies, right? Thumbs up means live, thumbs down means die. Simple, except we have no idea if that's actually how it worked. Ancient writers mention hand gestures in the arena, but they're really vague about what those gestures actually were. Some historians think thumbs down might have meant mercy, not death, or that the gesture was completely different from what we imagine. The thumbs down meaning death thing probably comes from a painting made in 1872 by a French artist named Ganleon. His painting shows a gladiator standing over a defeated opponent while the crowd gives thumbs down. That image became so iconic that it shaped how everyone imagined ancient Rome. Hollywood saw that painting and ran with it. Now it's in every gladiator movie ever made. But the truth is, we just don't know what those hand signals actually meant. Alright, here's a big one. The pyramids of Egypt. You've been told that they were built by slaves, right? Thousands of enslaved people forced to drag massive stones across the desert. Turns out, that's not true either. Modern archaeology has shown that the pyramids were built by paid workers. We've found the villages where these workers lived. We've found their graves. We can tell from their bones what kind of work they did and what they ate. These were skilled laborers. They got paid in food, beer, and other supplies. They had days off. When they got injured, they received medical care. Now, don't get me wrong, it was still brutal work. Moving those stones without modern equipment was incredibly hard and dangerous. But these weren't enslaved people. They were regular Egyptians, probably working in shifts during the flooding season when they couldn't farm their land. So where did the slave story come from? Partly from the Bible. The book of Exodus talks about Hebrew slaves in Egypt, and people just assumed that meant they built the pyramids. But there's no archaeological evidence connecting enslaved Hebrews to pyramid construction. The timelines don't even match up properly. Let's talk about Vikings for a second. What do you picture when you think of a Viking? Probably a huge guy with a horned helmet, right? Bad news. Vikings never wore horned helmets. Not once. Not ever. We found tons of Viking helmets in archaeological digs. None of them have horns. Horns would actually be a terrible idea in battle. They give your enemy something to grab. They throw off your balance. They're heavy and impractical. Real Viking helmets were simple and functional, usually just a rounded metal cap, sometimes with a nose guard. So why do we picture Vikings with horns? Blame opera. Seriously. In the 1800s, a costume designer working on Wagner's opera created helmets with horns because he thought they looked cool and dramatic. That image caught on. It showed up in art, books, and eventually movies. And now you can't think of Vikings without thinking of those horned helmets that they never actually wore. Here's one that might make you angry. You know how we're taught that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb? He didn't. He improved an existing design and made it practical for everyday use. But he wasn't the first person to create a working light bulb. More than 20 other people had already created versions of the light bulb before Edison got involved. British inventor Joseph Swan had a working light bulb before Edison. So did several other inventors. What Edison did was make a light bulb that lasted longer and could be produced cheaply. He also built the electrical systems needed to actually use light bulbs in homes. Those were huge achievements. But he wasn't the genius inventor who came up with the idea from scratch. Edison was really good at marketing himself, though. He made sure everyone knew his name. He took out patents, he fought legal battles, and because he controlled the narrative, history remembers him as the inventor of the light bulb. Let's jump to World War II. There's this story that the French immediately surrendered to Germany without putting up a fight, that French soldiers were cowards who just gave up. This is massively unfair. France lost about 90,000 soldiers in 6 weeks of fighting against Germany in 1940. That's 6 weeks. 90,000 dead. That's not cowardice. That's getting overwhelmed by a better-equipped military using new tactics. Germany had learned from World War I. They developed blitzkrieg tactics that France wasn't prepared for. France had built the Maginot Line, these massive fortifications, expecting another trench warfare situation. Germany just went around them through Belgium. French soldiers fought hard. They just got outmaneuvered and outgunned. But after the war, this myth about French cowardice spread like crazy. Part of it was British and American propaganda. Part of it was just making jokes. And it's completely unfair to the French soldiers who died trying to defend their country. Here's another one about World War II. You've heard that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war with Japan, right? That Japan was about to fight to the last person, and the bombs saved millions of lives by forcing a surrender. It's more complicated than that. Japan was already close to surrendering before the bombs dropped. Their military was destroyed. Their navy was gone. They had no resources left. American firebombing had already devastated most of their cities. The Soviet Union had just declared war on Japan and was about to invade. That was arguably a bigger factor in Japan's surrender than the atomic bombs. Japan's leadership was terrified of a Soviet invasion because they knew what that would mean. They'd seen what happened in Europe. Now, the bombs definitely played a role in the surrender. I'm not saying they didn't matter at all. But the idea that Japan would have fought forever without those bombs, that's not supported by the historical evidence. Many historians now think Japan would have surrendered within weeks anyway, especially once the Soviets got involved. But the narrative that the bombs solely ended the war became the official American story. And it's way more complicated than we were taught in school. Let's talk about Einstein for a minute. There's this popular story that he failed math as a kid, that he was a terrible student who barely graduated. This is completely false. Einstein was excellent at math from a young age. He was reading advanced mathematics textbooks when he was 12. He had mastered calculus as a teenager. So where did this myth come from? A misunderstanding about the grading system in Switzerland. In some Swiss schools, they changed their grading scale at one point. What used to be the highest grade became the lowest grade, and vice versa. Someone looked at Einstein's grades without understanding this change and thought he'd failed. They published this story, and it spread everywhere. People loved this myth because it's comforting. It makes Einstein seem more human. If even Einstein failed math, maybe there's hope for everyone, right? But the truth is, Einstein was a genius from the start. He didn't struggle with basic subjects. He was just bored by the rigid teaching methods of his time. All right, here's one more that might surprise you. You've probably heard that George Washington had wooden teeth. It's one of those facts that everyone knows, right? Except it's not true. Washington's dentures were made from lots of different materials. Metal, ivory, animal teeth, and yes, even human teeth. But not wood. Historians have examined Washington's actual dentures. They're on display at Mount Vernon. None of them are made of wood. So why does everyone think they were wooden? Probably because ivory dentures stain and darken over time. They end up looking kind of wood-like. Someone probably saw Washington's discolored dentures and assumed they were wooden. And that story just stuck around. But here's the darker part. Some of those dentures, they were made from teeth purchased from enslaved people. Washington paid enslaved people at Mount Vernon for their teeth, which were then used in his dentures. That's a part of the story that doesn't get told nearly as often. It's easier and more comfortable to imagine wooden teeth than to confront that reality. And that's the real problem with all these myths. They're not just wrong. They simplify history. They erase uncomfortable truths. They make heroes out of flawed people and villains out of others who didn't deserve it. History is messy and complicated and full of contradictions. Real people made real choices, some good and some terrible. When we learn the truth about these myths, we get a clearer picture of how the world actually worked. We understand our present better because we finally understand our past. These myths didn't just accidentally happen. Many of them were created on purpose to serve someone's agenda, to make a country look better, to justify a war, to sell a product, to win an election. And once they're out there, they're almost impossible to kill, because myths are easy to remember and easy to repeat. The truth is usually more complex and harder to explain, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying to find it. Every time we challenge one of these myths, we get a little bit closer to understanding what actually happened. So, the next time someone tells you a historical fact that sounds too perfect or too simple, ask questions. Look it up. Find out where that story came from and who benefits from people believing it. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got to where we are right now. And if we're learning the wrong lessons from fake stories, we're going to keep making the same mistakes over and over. That's it. That's why these myths matter. Not because they're fun trivia, but because they shaped how millions of people see the world. And understanding the truth, that changes everything. If this video changed how you think about history, hit that subscribe button.